Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome along. Thank you for tuning in. It's great that we can be together, albeit virtually. I'm very much looking forward to meeting with you all again in person very soon. We're continuing our series of parables this week, which we have entitled "Heaven is a Place on Earth." Now, if you're completely new to this kind of thing, or you're tuning in for the first time and you're not entirely sure what a parable is, don't worry. All they are is quite simply a collection of fictional stories that Jesus tells in the New Testament to illustrate what his kingdom will look like. And you'll find Jesus begins most of his parables with this phrase that we've become familiar with over the last few weeks: the kingdom of heaven is like ... Now, I don't know if the kingdom of heaven is a phrase that you've heard before. It's the title of a very good film by Ridley Scott about the Crusades. But it's also a phrase that's going to help us in framing our understanding of the parables and also the point in history in which Jesus is speaking. Now, part of what we've been learning in this series so far, and what we're hopefully going to continue to learn, is that the kingdom of heaven isn't just something up there and otherworldly with angels floating on clouds and that type of thing, but it also refers to the here and now. Us here today, as part of Christ Church in the 21st century, are part of this kingdom which Jesus is talking about. Now, I don't know what springs to your mind when you think of the word kingdom. For me, I picture something vaguely medieval with peasants and swords and pestilence and that kind of thing. But for Jesus' audience listening to him, the idea of a physical kingdom was perfectly familiar to them. They understood what it was like to live in a kingdom under a king or an emperor, and all the connotations that came with that. Whereas for us, it's a little bit more far removed from our way of thinking. And so what we've been seeing over the past few weeks is that Jesus has deliberately taken this familiar idea of a kingdom and permeated it with ideas that are quite unfamiliar to the people who are listening to him. And I think it's probably something that bears remembering just as we get into this text, that to us today, parables like the Good Samaritan, for instance, or maybe the parable of the sower, they've become kind of ingrained in our minds a little bit. And maybe sort of within our popular culture, it's something that we find quite familiar. The phrase "he's a good Samaritan," for instance, it's quite familiar to us. But back then, these ideas were completely radical and completely new to the people listening. And I hope that if we delve deep enough, we might still be made to sit up and think about some of these parables in a way that perhaps the first hearers would have experienced. So let's dive in again to the parable that we had, that Ash very kindly read for us. So we have the parable itself in verses 24 to 29, as he said, and then a few verses later in private to his disciples, Jesus gives the explanation in verses 36 to 43. So I'm just going to read the first 3 verses again. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. So just as a kind of general outline, as we go forward today, I just want to suggest one question that this parable should make us ask. And as a result of that, 2 things that this parable should make us do. So my first point, my question is, how can the wheat and the weeds coexist? And once we've answered this, I'm hoping that this parable will 2, cause us to examine ourselves, and 3, cause us to persevere in our faith. So point number 1 then, how can the wheat and the weeds coexist? So we've been presented with these 2 groups, wheat and weeds, and the explanation that Jesus gives us from verses 36 to 43, we have this metaphor which illustrates 2 types of people of God and people of the devil, or people of the evil one. And what we see from the first few verses is that they are quite hard to tell apart. Verse 27 tells us that they're so indistinguishable that the servants didn't notice them at first because they look so similar. Now, just for a little bit of context, according to a couple of the commentaries, which Ash has very kindly lent me, there's a certain type of weed called darnel. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it was common in this area at this particular time. And the annoying thing about this weed was that it looked very similar to wheat. And it wasn't until it fully flowered that you could actually distinguish them and tell them apart. And what's more, it actually entwined its roots with the wheat, meaning that you couldn't actually pull them apart straight away, or you'd end up pulling up the good crop with the weeds. Also during this time, apparently it was a thing for rival farmers to sow weeds in each other's fields. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but apparently it happened. So much so to the point where there was a specific Roman law which actually forbade sowing seed in somebody else's field. So that's why the idea of an enemy sowing seed in your field in verse 28 would have clicked with the people that Jesus was talking to, even though that might seem a little bit strange to us. Now, just as a quick aside, I don't want to get too hung up on this, but I think it's something worth mentioning. There's some debate amongst Christians and amongst Bible scholars about what the field actually represents in this text. The field being the place where these two groups exist. Now, verse 38 clearly tells us that the field represents the world. But if you scan down to verse 41, Jesus narrows the parameters a little bit and refers specifically to the kingdom or the church. And various clever people with beards and corduroy trousers have argued about, should the church be kept pure because the people of the devil exist kind of out there in the wider world, or is he talking about these two groups coexisting within close confines of the kingdom itself? Now, in my very humble opinion, I think there's probably room for both viewpoints. But for the purposes of today, I'm just going to be talking primarily within a kingdom church type context. And I think based on some of the reading that I've done and based on other areas of the Bible, I don't think that's too much of a stretch. I don't think it's doing the text an injustice. So it's just something to bear in mind as we go forward. So we've got children of God, children of the devil existing together within the kingdom. Now, I'm sure that sounds pretty far out as a concept. It sounds pretty mad today. I'm sure it sounded pretty crazy the first time Jesus said it. So if we fast forward then to our 2021 contemporary Castleford church context, I don't know if someone asked you to draw up a list of your requirements for a good church. I don't know what you'd write down. Good coffee, maybe, comfy chairs, good fellowship, good preaching, perhaps. But I don't imagine anybody would write down on their list, should contain people of Satan. But nonetheless, this is what Jesus is telling us that we're going to get. So I guess the next most obvious question would be, well, what do these people of the devil actually look like? Now, if you're starting with the presupposition that the devil is this kind of mythical creature with a pitchfork and a pointed tail who goes around wreaking havoc and suffering, then yeah, it probably sounds a little bit silly. And you might also be sort of thinking of people of the devil in a kind of similar Hollywood type way, people who do Ouija boards and wear black, Now, I don't know where that idea entered popular culture. I don't think it came from the Bible, or at least if it did, it's taken some serious detours along the way. And admittedly, in Scripture, we get the devil being represented through lots of different types of imagery. Sometimes he's portrayed as a snake, sometimes a lion, or a beast of some kind. But I'm not too sure that the Bible ever intended us to kind of run away with these ideas and pictures. So I just want to consider an alternative for a minute. I'll look very quickly at the devil as he's depicted in the Bible. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the film The Usual Suspects, but if you have, you'll be familiar with the famous line from Kaiser Soze: the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Now that sounds quite cool and quite Hollywood, but the more I kind of think about it, I think, you know what, he might have a point there. So yeah, let's dive in and see what the Bible actually says about the devil himself. So right back at the beginning in Genesis 3, Verse 2, we find straight away he undermines the authority of God when he tells Eve that she will not surely die if she eats of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He also sows doubt in the mind of Eve about the trustworthiness of God when he asks, did God really say you can't eat the fruit of the tree? He just doesn't want you to have the knowledge that he's got. Skipping forward to Matthew chapter 4, the devil tempts Jesus himself by taking him to a very high mountain and showing him the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give to you, he says in verse 9, if you will only bow down and worship me. So temptation is something the devil has in his armory. He tempts us with enticing things that are supposedly better than what God can offer us. And skipping forward again to John 8, verse 44, we learn that the devil deals in lies. When he, the devil, lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So armed with this knowledge then, let's ask ourselves the question again, how can the church contain people of the devil? Well, ask yourself, does the church contain people that give in to temptation? Does the church contain liars? Does the church contain people that are greedy and enticed by power? Does the church contain doubters and people that aren't sure about their faith? And then maybe ask yourself the question, if you're a professing child of God, have you ever been characterized by any of those things? And so when you think about these questions a little bit more, it becomes clearer that people of God and people of the devil can coexist in perhaps closer proximity than you might think. In other words, the church is a bit of a mess. It's an eclectic mix of people, and it's only in the fullness of time and through the grace and power of God that those who truly belong to him will be perfected. If you think in the church is this perfect environment full of virtuous people, then think again. One day it will be. That's why part of the reason why we've called this title of this talk, Anticipate. It will be perfect one day, but until then, this parable tells us we're going to be in this battle against the forces of evil, both within us and outside of us. So the question is now then, what do we do with this information? Well, as I said at the beginning, I'm hoping very much that my second point, this parable will make us look at ourselves and examine ourselves. It's going to go back to the passage again, verse 24. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from? And the enemy did this, he replied. Now, we've established the wheat and the weeds are quite hard to tell apart. So if we're thinking logically, we have to surmise from this text that it can be possible to look like, it can be possible to sound like, it can even be possible to live like a child of God and not actually be one, to the point where even angels can't tell you apart from the true children of God. Look at verse 27 again. The owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from? In other words, where did these people of the devil turn up from? We didn't know they were there. Now, to be honest, when I was thinking about how I could illustrate this point, as tragic as it is, I genuinely can't think of a better way to summarize this than to talk about a guy called Ravi Zacharias. Now, some of you will know who I'm talking about, and your hearts may be already sunk. Some of you, like me, I hadn't heard of him until about 2-3 months ago. But basically, Ravi Zacharias was a Canadian pastor, preacher, author, touched millions of people all over the world, so I understand it. Wrote books that have been reprinted in loads of different languages, and really encouraged lots of Christians in their faith, my wife included. And he very sadly passed away in springtime last year. And a little bit like Jimmy Savile, I guess, all this sordid, horrible information came out after his death about a trail of sexual exploitation and abuse and harassment that he left behind him. and how he abused his position, even invoked God in justifying some of these awful things that he did. Now, I don't know what the state of this man's heart was when he died. I wasn't a fly on the wall during the conversation that he had with God. But at the very least, all this stuff that's come to light has to at least call into question the faith that he professed. I don't know if it eliminates it entirely, but it certainly calls it into question. This was a man that made a career out of helping people understand the Bible, and no doubt led countless people to faith. If ever there was a man that looked nailed on as a piece of wheat, this was the guy. And the implication from this parable is that everyone in the world, even angels, might be taken in by your charade and your appearance as a Christian. You might be the most convincing piece of wheat the world has ever seen, to the point where millions of people listen to you. But crucially, God will not be taken in. Verse 27, where did the weeds come from? Verse 28, an enemy did this. He replied, God knew all along. God knew it was the work of the enemy, and he won't be deceived. So then, if you're anything like me, the burning question from this is, how on earth can I be sure that I am a piece of wheat, that I am a child of God? If angels can't even tell the difference and the world can be fooled, how can I be sure I'm not fooling myself? Now, we need to say straight away that this is an important question to ask. The Bible tells us clearly to examine ourselves and to work out our salvation with a certain amount of fear. So the question is then, what's a good way to examine yourself? Now, I once heard John Piper say that the human heart's a little bit like an onion. Bear with me, this is going somewhere, I promise. In so much as that when you're looking inward to self-examine, and you start asking questions of yourself and you peel back a layer, as it were, you're just presented with more layers. In other words, looking internally to try and find the answer to whether you truly are a child of God is more likely to throw up more questions than answers. Now, incidentally, in John chapter 6, Jesus' disciples come to him and they ask quite a similar question. Verse 28, then they asked him, what must we do to do the works God requires? In other words, what do we have to do to make sure we're part of the wheat? To make sure we're children of God. Jesus answered, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. And I think fundamentally this is one of the central points to self-examination. It's not necessarily what does your heart say about who you are, it's what does your heart have to say about who Jesus is. Do you believe in the one he has sent? Now, please don't think that I'm saying that this is a license to kind of live how you want, just so long as you've got belief. Jesus clearly calls us to obedience and to live a certain way. And he tells us the fruit of our lives will show if we believe or not. Think back to Rabbi Zacharias, the way he lived seriously called into question what he said he believed. But if you're like me and you're occasionally prone to panic about whether you're deceiving yourself about being part of the children of God, I would encourage you not to look at the onion of your heart and your own works and should I have said this and should I have done that. Beating yourself up can often lead to paralysis, can't it? That's exactly what happened to Judas Iscariot. He was paralyzed by his guilt to the point where the only way out he could see was suicide. But thankfully, there's a far better and far more liberating alternative, which is to look at Jesus, to look at what he's accomplished on the cross, look at all that he says he has in store for you, and ask yourself, is he enough? Is he like oxygen to you? Do you need him like you need your breath? Is he your only hope, or is he just another facet of your life that you dip in and out of occasionally? The parable of the weeds should cause us to look at ourselves and examine ourselves, yes, but it should not cause us to rely on ourselves. And the fundamental difference between the wheat and the weeds is what you decide to do with the person and work of Jesus Christ. And finally, and very briefly, as I said before, I hope this parable will encourage us to persevere. I'm going to go from verse 29. While you are pulling the weeds up, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them off in bundles to be burned, and gather the wheat and bring them into my barn. So there's clearly a day coming when the full identity of the wheat and the weed will be revealed. One day, the children of the devil are going to look far less conspicuous, and equally the children of God are going to shine like the sun. And everything that causes sin and all who do evil will be thrown in the fire, verse 41. The world is a mess. The church is a mess. But there's a day coming when the distinction will be clear. Which means, bluntly, we've got to hang in there. There's so many Bible verses that I could have chosen to talk about the importance of perseverance. But the one I think sums this up quite succinctly comes from later on in Matthew 24, when Jesus is preaching again, and he says quite simply, the one who endures to the end will be saved. Yes, what distinguishes the wheat from the weeds is faith in Jesus, but you have to go on believing it is not a temporal thing. The wheat starts life as grain, but it's not until it fully flowers that it's ready to be harvested. So keep going and keep holding on. Maybe you're fed up with another church service online. Maybe you're fed up of not having any fellowship. Maybe your prayer life's gone cold. Maybe you're slipping into old sins and old habits. But please be encouraged and challenged at the same time to keep going, because the reward is great and the alternative doesn't bear thinking about. And equally, if you're new to church or you're still making your mind up about some of the claims of Jesus, what this parable is equally saying is that there's still time for you to make a decision. Every day God gives us is a mercy. The wheat and the weeds haven't fully grown yet. The day is not yet at hand. But the day is coming when the identity of both groups will be revealed. And Jesus says we'll be found on one side or the other. The devil is very much at work in the church, as we've seen. So we need to look at ourselves and we need to persevere, but we can't do that without the help of Jesus. I just want to give a very, very quick illustration as I'm finishing, which I feel kind of sums this up quite well. If you live around here, in the last 12 months or so, you've probably been to Nostell Priory at some point, because there's literally nothing else to do. And me and the family were walking around Nostell Priory the other week, and you'll know there's a kind of part of the walk where you come across these huge, great fallen trees. I don't know what type of trees they are, but they look like the type of ones that lived for hundreds of years, and they've kind of toppled over, and even the roots are sort of 10 feet high, and they're sort of decaying and rotting into the ground. And as I kind of looked at them, I said to Holly, it makes me a little bit sad, to be honest. But as Martha runs up and starts climbing all over the branches and stuff, and you look a little bit closer, you can see all these tiny little organisms and plants and shoots that are coming up that are feeding directly off the decaying wood that the fallen trees are leaving behind. And I think this is, in a way, that's quite a good way to sum up our lives as wheat, if you like. Jesus died to give us life and growth, and we feed on him as the sustenance of our faith. And it's the exact illustration we get when we take communion. And it was his sacrifice which gives us hope. But crucially, it's because he lives that we can look forward to the day when we're going to shine like the sun in his kingdom.
Cheers, guys. Thanks for sticking around. If you've stuck around at home, thanks for the message, Joe. Welcome along, Jude.
Very welcome.
Thanks.
I'm just thinking that was, I don't know, I don't know what Paul would say, but I think that was one of the harder parables, Joe. I think you copped for it there. I think that's
yeah, there's a recurring theme here, I seem to know.
Do you know when somebody comes along, like first day at work, somebody comes along for the first time and you go, let's give them this to do. I felt,
Yeah.
But it's but a real sort of not just a challenge, but a real sort of underneath the challenge is like a real excitement, real encouragement, I think, at knowing knowing how this works out. And I think I mentioned this at the start. I keep on being encouraged that these parables seem to shed a lot of truth. Shed a lot of light on how things actually are. They must have sounded, back, to first hearers, Joe, like really. They would have understood where Jesus was coming from, talking, with his agricultural language. But some of the way that some of the way that Jesus described the kingdom working out, they must have thought, I can't really begin to see this. But yet, as you see the sort of descriptions that we're getting, like a mustard seed, really small, getting really big, and here with the idea that this grace for us, you know what I mean, that Jesus sort of comes, but doesn't come. He comes with grace that screams and judgment to follow, but for the moment, grace, and you sort of see it really clearly in these parables. So thanks for sharing that. What are your guys' thoughts on? So we talked about. I think you described him, Joe, as the enemy, and that you talked a little bit about temptation. What were your first thoughts of the devil when you were a kid? How do you see the devil? Any thoughts, you two?
I'll let you go first, Jude. Go on.
I thought it was really helpful the way you unpacked that in the talk, Joe. The idea of what the devil uses as his tools, his deception, that he's a liar and things like that. And I think there's a huge difference between the cartoon Hollywood version and and the reality of what that's like. I think what you were saying, Ash, about these parables and the kind of reality of what we see. Actually, we see that the world isn't the way it should be, and we see people behave in a way that they shouldn't behave. And I think that at times that speaks of the brokenness of the world that sin causes, but I think it also speaks of the work of the devil in terms of his ability to break things down, break what was intended for good, to manipulate it in such a way that it's broken down.
Yeah, I think kind of the more I get older, it sounds kind of archaic and outdated, the works of Satan.
Oh yeah.
But the more you
not a phrase in my vocabulary. Really.
No, it's not. It's not one you often even hear in church. Like it sounds a bit daft. And to be honest, when I was younger, I don't really think I give it a second thought. To be honest, But the more you kind of look at the world around us and see some of the depths of evil that human beings are capable of, I think it's probably only natural to surmise that it's satanic to some degree. I think one thing I was thinking about when I was drawing the talk up was everything that happened in the scandal in the Catholic Church in Boston and all the cover-ups and the horrible child sexual abuse that went on. And I'm kind of thinking, I can't really think of another way to phrase that other than satanic, really, which is kind of strange in a way when you think about how it occurred.
We don't often use the phrase, the work of the devil, but we often use the word evil. That's in our popular culture, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
Like newspapers, when a really tragic, awful event has happened, I think maybe we're more comfortable with labeling something as evil. Do you think that's true?
I think it is true, yeah, but everybody's got their own standard of what that looks like, which I think maybe convolutes the issue slightly. But I mean, it's something you see in newspaper headlines everywhere. Something.
I thought it was helpful, Joe. How you, so when you sort of breached the subject of the devil, so you sort of gently said both we could think of it as the world and we could think of it as church, and I agree. I think both, there's a sense in which both of those can be true. But we do, when you went down that road, you initially imagine the great evil, and we can go to the kind of examples that you've given of the Catholic Church and others, and you kind of see it. But the parable does cause you to examine. I thought that was really helpful. The parable does cause you to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who needs to examine themselves, and that is kind of one of the things that the Bible does. It sort of levels because it's a grace-soaked message, because it reaches everyone. It levels everything out, doesn't it? So we can't we c- and I thought you did that really well, where you sort of said, look over here, and then you went, oh, but actually we're all a little bit touched by this, and we're all growing up, in this mess, and we are all, we all need to take a look, and because I think as well, it was helpful to sort of think it through, because we're growing up, as you described the weeds, which I think is the reality of it. It does make it makes it it's confusing, and it's difficult, and we are near temptation, a lot of the time. And the way you described the quote from, what was the film?
Usual suspect.
Usual Suspects, Kaiser Soze. Yeah, just I didn't know it was from that film, but I've heard the quote before, and yeah, it sounds unlikely at first, and then you think, actually, that the idea that the devil is a liar and attempt to, um, and he's sort of telling his lies. He's not out. He doesn't want us to think of him. Doesn't help him for us to think of him as like the Man United. What do you call
Careful.
it? The Man United mascot. Don't know what the score is. But the Man United mascot. It doesn't help us to think of him like that. It helps us. He's better suited if we don't think of him at all.
Yeah, he doesn't want you to think of him like that. I don't think it's, I'm sure he doesn't want you getting hung up on being afraid of him, to be honest. He'd much rather you think as little about him as possible, and go on living your life and depend on yourself and do whatever you want to do. Just don't consider the claims of Jesus. And yeah, I think you'll probably be quite happy.
Any thoughts on what it means to examine ourselves then? What's that look like for you two? How do we go about that? Because that's really, the Bible does confront us sometimes, doesn't it? When it asks, because you always do, whenever you think about evil or the work of the devil or anything like that, you just go immediately, human nature to go, it's something as bad as, as the Catholic priest or Ravi Zacharias or something like that. But how do we actually dare to look in at ourselves? How do we do that?
Yeah, I think it's really tough, because the minute you almost you look in, you start to judge other people and put yourself on a scale of, I'm not that bad. Do you know? So I think that the being judgmental of others as we try and justify our own shortcomings is really, really difficult. But I think what Joe was saying about looking to Jesus is a huge bar, but an inspiring bar to go for, and a great leveler in terms of how we examine ourselves. I thought that was really helpful, Joe.
Yeah, and I think alternatively as well, you may be tempted to think I'm too bad. Some of us might think I'm not as bad as this next guy, or some of us might think I'm too terrible and too awful. And like you say, it's a great leveler. Everybody has their own definition and their own understanding of justice, but like I say, the gospel is for everybody, and so it has to put everybody on a level playing field to some degree.
Yeah.
And go on, Jude.
I was just thinking about that idea of justice today, that we all kind of call for justice, especially when we see great, terrible acts like the ones we've mentioned already, and we go, justice must be done, but we kind of want our own justice to be done. And I think when we look to God in those things, actually, we put ourselves under the authority of His justice, and actually His justice is never too harsh or never too slack. Do you know, like, it's the perfect response. And yeah, I think that looking to God more than looking to our own, how we would resolve it, is the challenge, I think. What were you going to say, Ash?
Yeah, no, I agree. I was just looking at the clock, and I was conscious that the sort of the title of the talk was Anticipate. And as I was hearing you preach, Joe, and thinking, with having this word up on my screen and thinking through what that would mean, sometimes we just the Christian life can feel just like waiting for God. That used to be a TV series, doesn't it? There's just a sense in which you wait for it to come. But actually, this parable does cause us to. I love how it ends. The last verse says, "The righteous will then the righteous after all this has happened, then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father." There's a sense that is something to anticipate and not just wait for. And I think that's been a helpful thing. Might help us with you called us to persevere, Joe. I think how do we do that? I think one of the ways that we can carry on going is to be people who are. I had a quick look on Merriam-Webster to see what anticipate meant, and there's just this idea that you just throw yourself into getting excited about it. And I think we can do that. We can do that. It's a story that causes us to do that. I think there's an encouragement for us not just to sit and wait on our hands and just like, oh, why don't you come, God? There's a sense in which it's great and it's going to happen, and we can live in anticipation of it in the same way we do for the end of lockdown. That idea that we're just already talking about where we're going to go and eat. We're already talking about who we're going to meet up with, and we just that's the chat the whole time. And it's probably the only way you can get through, isn't it, to the end of lockdown, by talking about how you're going to anticipate or anticipating its end. And I think there's an encouragement for us with the kingdom to live in anticipation of it, to live that all the time, to make it part of our chat, to be encouraged by it, and those sorts of things. Sorry, that was in my notes. That was a question, and I just went straight into a ramble. My apologies. Any
So
thoughts?
how do we do this, Ash? Because I'm with you. I'm like, yeah. I want to anticipate it. I want to be excited about it rather than ache for it. Because in my heart, often it's an ache of, I want things to be better than they are. How do we live excited, anticipated?
I think one of the ways then, just on the back of this, is that knowing that justice will come. I think particularly in the days that we live in just now, that is cause to give me such hope. Because I think when I think about how justice might ever happen in our world, every time I run down the road of how we're going to end poverty, how we're going to end, inequality or racism or whatever else it is, and I just always see it as being impossible, and it's so depressing. But yet the fact that I can rest in the fact that God's going to bring justice, and in doing that, deal with me, at the same time. I think it's exactly as Joe says. I go back to that story of the cross, and I'm just like, I just rest in that as much as I can. Just go, phew, thank goodness that's the story, and justice doesn't depend on politicians coming up with answers or me trying to live a good life. The gospel, Joe reminded us, it doesn't. We've still got to be obedient. We've still got a direction of travel. I think we've still got callings and all that sort of stuff, but it's outside of our means to achieve it. And I think part of the story of a Christian is just to keep reflecting on that, just to keep going over and over that ground again. We just forget that tale, so we forget the brilliance of salvation. We forget the peace that comes, and we forget all that. Forget the forgiveness that that is ours in Jesus. And I think just to dwell on that is part of the anticipation. Be excited about the coming again of the King. I think that's about as far as we should go. Trying not to sound too much like a local newsreader. Cheers, Joe. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great week. Join us again next week for the last in the series.
Thanks for tuning in. See everybody soon.
See you later.